The phrase sour grapes originated with Aesop's fable, The Fox and the Grapes, where this fox sees these amazing lush grapes and he tries to reach for them and he tries and can't get them. So he ultimately says, they're probably just sour anyway. And a quick Google search will say that this expression is used when someone puts something down in a negative way or makes it out to be unimportant solely because it is unattainable to them. So much of what the Mormon Church promises is unattainable because it's fictional. So if you choose to watch this video, I encourage you to put on your critical thinking cap and dare to get a little uncomfortable because I might say some things that will put you in a place of discomfort. The first of these sour grapes that the church just dangles in front of its members is the teaching that you will gain a testimony through the bearing of it. You've probably heard that teaching several times before. Every month in the Mormon Church, they have this fast and testimony meeting where members of the church are encouraged to come up and bear their testimony of the truthfulness of the church. And if you don't have a very strong testimony, we'll bear it anyway, and it's going to get stronger. Serve a mission to strengthen your testimony, because even though you don't fully believe those things, the more you teach, the more you're going to believe it. Religion calls this faith. Psychology calls this gaslighting. You're convincing yourself that you're crazy or you're wrong if you don't conform to what someone else teaches is true. In the end, there's really no evidence to support that the church is true. You may convince yourself saying, well, I've had these feelings. And people tell me that when I have these feelings, it means that the church is true. And I hear other people bearing their testimony. That's not how truth works. For example, you can spend every day of your life convincing yourself that the earth is flat. You can join a flat earther society. You can read literature to convince yourself that the earth is flat. You can ignore evidence from science, from photographs from space, from the horizon of the earth. You can do everything in your power to convince yourself that the earth is flat. But the truth will not change. We have evidence to show us that the earth is a globe. Just because you believe something doesn't necessarily make it true. Just because you convince yourself that the Mormon Church is God's one true church on earth does not make it true. So before anyone here wants to convince themselves or me that I just never believed enough, I didn't work hard enough for my testimony, I just wanted to sin, or whatever excuses you give those people who choose to leave the church, please listen to some evidence first. I was a true believing Mormon for 45 years of my life. I was born into the church. We lived the gospel. I was baptized at 8. I graduated from seminary. I went on a full-time mission. I went to 4+ years of institute. I worked in the temple. I was sealed in the temple. I served as Relief Society president, Young Women's president, several different callings in my life. I read the Book of Mormon more times than I can count. I did everything I could in my power to convince myself that this was the true church. I got up and fasted a testimony meeting and testified of the truthfulness of the gospel because I had been told that my testimony would be strengthened through the bearing of it. But even when I was at my strongest, when I was convinced that these feelings told me that the church was true, deep down, if I was honest with myself, I would have recognized that I had some issues with church history, with church doctrine, with church practices that just did not feel right. Things like polygamy, the fact that Black men did not get the priesthood until the year I was born, the Mountain Meadows Massacre, the fact that the church covers up abuse. A lot of things were put on the shelf in the back of my mind because I had been taught by one of my favorite apostles to doubt my doubts before I doubted my faith. And so rather than having the courage to address these issues straight on, I also did what I'd been taught. Avoid anti-Mormon literature. Ultimately, my hunger for the truth, my discomfort in these things that I didn't fully understand, caused me to go on a hunt for the truth. I just couldn't be satiated any longer with that response. We'll figure it out in the next life. I had to build up the courage to read things that made me feel uncomfortable. I questioned those things that were on my proverbial shelf. And last summer, I spent hours and hours and hours researching, trying to make sense of these things that had always bothered me. Because the church is built on falsehoods. These grapes, or these unattainable promises from the church, not only are sour, they're holographic. The church is dangling these promises above us, but they're not real. We don't get a stronger testimony by sweeping our issues under the rug and just bearing testimony and gaslighting ourselves into believing things that are not true. If you have the courage to get uncomfortable, I encourage you to read literature like the CES letter, a letter to my wife, and the church's very own gospel topics essays. Watch and listen to media that causes you to think and maybe makes you a little uncomfortable, because discomfort is where learning happens. This idea of bearing your testimony until you believe it is the first of these sour grapes I find within the LDS Church. It's kind of lit a fire under me. I've got a few others that I'd like to share. So if you're willing, follow along, and I can talk about some things that might cause a little bit of discomfort.